The wire hits at 11:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. $1 million minus the taxes you'll owe in April that nobody mentioned at the closing dinner. You stare at the number in your banking app like it's going to blink first. 7 years of nights of investors who ghosted, of eating gas station sushi at your desk, and now here it is, sitting in a checking account that was built to hold direct deposits from a job you don't have anymore. You do the thing everyone does. You Google what to do after selling your company. And somewhere around the fourth article, a phrase catches your eye that you've heard rich people use in interviews. Family office, you picture it immediately. Glass conference room, a guy named Chip managing your portfolio. Maybe a private chef. You think, that's me now? I need one of those. You do not need one of those. Here's the part nobody tells you at the closing table, the part that would save half of new money America a lot of wasted money and worse decisions. A family office isn't a vibe. It isn't a status object you unlock the moment your net worth crosses 7 figures, like a badge on a video game achievement screen. It's an actual operating business, with actual overhead, built to run the financial life of a family whose wealth is too large and too complicated for a single financial advisor to handle on their own. Think of it less like a bank account and more like a company. One whose only client is you and your descendants for the next 100 years. A real family office does 3 things, and it does all 3, not one. It handles governance, meaning the rules and structures for how decisions get made, who gets a vote, and what happens when your kids inherit money they didn't earn and might not be ready for. It handles investment management, meaning someone is actively allocating your capital across private equity, real estate, hedge funds, venture deals, the stuff that doesn't show up on a robo-advisor app. And it handles administration, meaning tax planning across multiple entities, trust structures, insurance, sometimes even paying the household staff and managing the art collection. Some family offices employ 20, 30, even 100 people. Full-time, just for one family. That machine costs money to run. Industry data puts the operating cost of a single family office somewhere between $1 million and $3 million a year. Sometimes more once you're paying for in-house lawyers and a chief investment officer. Which means the math only works, the math only makes sense, once your total wealth is large enough that a couple million a year in overhead is a rounding error, not a crisis. That threshold, according to nearly every wealth management study you'll find, sits around $50 million in investable assets, and the real infrastructure, the kind you're picturing with the glass conference room, usually doesn't get built until closer to $100 million. Below that, you're not skipping a step by not having one. You're just early, very, very early. So if you just exited for $1 million or even $5 million and you're sitting there thinking you need a family office, you're not behind. You're playing the wrong game entirely. It's like graduating middle school and asking where you pick up your retirement pension. This is where most people get it backwards, and it's the mistake that quietly wrecks more first-time exits than bad investments ever do. They see the language of ultra-wealth, family office, private banking, wealth preservation, and they try to install the tools of a $200 million fortune onto a $1 million balance sheet. They hire a wealth manager who charges 1% a year to manage money that should just be sitting safely, earning interest, while they figure out their next move. They start an LLC for tax reasons a CPA never actually recommended. They buy the illiquid alternative investment because it's what they read billionaires do, without asking whether they can survive not touching that money for 7 years. Wrong tools, wrong level, wrong game. You wouldn't bring a company's org chart to a lemonade stand. Same idea. So here's what we're actually going to do in this video. We're going to treat your net worth like a leveling system, the same way you'd level up a character in a game you actually enjoy playing. Each level unlocks new tools, new risks, and new mistakes to avoid, and none of it works if you skip ahead. You start at level 0 or 1, somewhere between $0 and $5 million, where the entire job is stabilization, not empire building. You move to level 2, roughly $5 to $15 million, where you start building actual infrastructure, a real advisor team, proper tax structuring, entity formation that does something. Level 3 and 4 take you from $15 million up toward $30 or $40 million, where multifamily offices and more sophisticated private investing start to make sense. And level 5, the one everyone's chasing when they say family office, doesn't unlock until you're sitting somewhere north of $50 million, sometimes $100 million, where the machine finally justifies its own cost. Right now, fresh off that $1 million wire, you are standing at level 0. Maybe the very early edge of level 1, and what that money actually buys you isn't a dynasty. It's not a legacy, it's stability. It's the ability to breathe for the first time in years without checking your bank balance before you order coffee. That's it. That's the whole unlock. And it's a bigger unlock than it sounds like, if you don't blow it. Because here's the mistake almost everyone makes in the first 90 days after a life-changing payout, the one we're going to walk through next. They confuse the size of the number with the size of the identity. They start acting like the person they think a millionaire should be, instead of the person who just got handed the rarest thing money can actually buy at this stage. Time to not screw it up. Level 1 doesn't feel like a level. It feels like a waiting room. You've got $1 million sitting in an account that used to hold your salary, and the first thing that should happen isn't a Rolex, a Tesla, or a phone call to a wealth manager you found through a LinkedIn ad. It's math you don't want to do. Taxes, debt, and a number sitting in cash that you are not allowed to touch, no matter how loud the rest of your life is screaming at you to touch it. Start with taxes because the IRS doesn't care that you just had the best week of your life. Depending on how your exit was structured, stock sale, asset sale, earnout, you could owe anywhere from 20% to 37% of that number back come April, sometimes more if state tax wants a piece too. Nobody mentioned this at the closing dinner because closing dinners are for champagne, not spreadsheets. So step 1, before you do anything else, is setting aside what you actually owe in a boring, separate, untouched account. Not invested, not working for you, just sitting there waiting to leave, like a guest who overstayed and needs to go home. Step 2 is debt. If you're carrying high-interest debt, credit cards, a personal loan, anything north of 7 or 8%, you pay it down now, aggressively, before you invest a single dollar into anything with a ticker symbol. This isn't exciting advice. Nobody made a movie about the guy who paid off his Amex. But a guaranteed 22% return, which is what you get from erasing a credit card at 22% interest, beats almost every investment you could chase in year 1 of having money. Step 3, and this is the one people skip because it feels like doing nothing, is the liquidity buffer. 6 to 12 months of full living expenses, sitting in cash or something just as boring, like a high-yield savings account or a money market fund. Not invested, not locked up, just there, so that if the next 12 months throw a surprise at you, a medical bill, a slow job search, a market dip, you're not forced to sell something at the worst possible moment to cover rent. Here's the part where most people fail, and it's not the math. It's the identity. The second that number lands, something in your brain starts asking, what would a rich person do right now? And the answer your brain gives you is almost always wrong, because it's built from movies and Instagram, not from anyone who's actually managed money well. This is lifestyle creep's favorite doorway. You upgrade the car. You upgrade the apartment. You start using the phrase portfolio in casual conversation about a brokerage account with $40,000 in it. You hire a family office-style wealth manager who charges 1% a year, which on $1 million is $10,000 annually, to do something a much cheaper advisor could do just as well, sometimes better. You form an LLC because you read somewhere that rich people have LLCs without a single lawyer or CPA telling you why or for what. That LLC now costs you a few $100s a year in filing fees to protect exactly nothing, because there's no actual business or liability it's shielding. This is premature infrastructure. It's building the org chart before you have the company. At level 1 and 2, the real infrastructure you need is small, boring, and cheap compared to what you're picturing. A good CPA, not a fancy one who understands exits and can help you plan quarterly estimated taxes so April doesn't blindside you again. A fee-only financial advisor, meaning someone paid a flat fee or hourly rate, not a percentage of your assets, so their advice isn't secretly biased toward managing more of your money for a bigger cut. And an estate attorney for the basics, a will, maybe a simple revocable trust if you have kids or property. Beneficiary designations updated on every account, because you'd be shocked how many people build a whole financial life and forget to update the beneficiary form from an ex-girlfriend they haven't spoken to in 6 years. That's it. That's the whole infrastructure at this level. Not a boardroom, not a chip, a CPA, an advisor, and a lawyer, each doing one job well, each billed transparently, none of them managing a machine that doesn't exist yet. Now, the investing part, because this is where DIY plans quietly die. You'll be tempted to pick stocks, to time the market, to put a chunk into whatever your friend from business school is raising a seed round for because it feels like the founder thing to do. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The data on individual investors trying to beat the market is brutal. Most professional fund managers can't consistently beat a simple index fund over 10 years, and you are not a professional fund manager 3 weeks removed from your first $1 million. A simple allocation at this stage might look like 60% in a diversified low-cost index fund portfolio, stocks across US and international markets, 30% in bonds or fixed income for stability, and the remaining 10% for higher risk plays. If you genuinely can't resist, your next venture, a friend's startup, whatever scratches that itch, capped at an amount you could lose completely without it changing your life. Because here's the actual goal of level 1 and 2. It isn't to preserve $1 million forever, sitting untouched like a museum piece. It's to stabilize it, protect it from taxes, debt, and your own worst instincts, and then deploy the surplus after the buffer, after the debt, after the tax reserve into either a diversified portfolio or your next venture. So that number starts compounding into something bigger. Somewhere between $3 and $5 million, something shifts. The taxes are handled, the debt is gone, the buffer exists. And what's left isn't just a nice exit anymore. It's real investable wealth, the kind that starts generating its own income, its own optionality, its own gravity. That's the milestone, not a title, not a family office. Just enough real, working capital that the next level of problems, the good problems, actually become available to you. Somewhere around $5 million, the waiting room turns into an actual office. Not a physical one, not yet, maybe not ever. But this is the level where I'll just Google it and figure it out stops being a viable strategy because the number of moving parts has grown past what one CPA and one fee-only advisor can juggle in a quarterly call. This is where you meet the term virtual family office, and it sounds fancier than it is. It's not a floor of an office building with your last name etched into the glass. It's a coordinated team of specialists, most of whom you'll never meet in person, working together on your finances the way a surgical team works on a patient, each person doing their one job well, none of them living in your house. A fractional CFO who oversees the whole financial picture a few hours a month. A tax strategist who does more than file your return, someone actively looking for ways to save you money before December 31st, not just reporting what already happened after the fact. An investment manager who builds and rebalances a portfolio that's no longer just some index funds and a savings account, because at this size, that portfolio needs actual architecture. Here's the number that makes this real for most people. A good virtual family office setup at this level runs somewhere between $30,000 and $80,000 a year, depending on complexity. That sounds like a lot until you compare it to what happens without it. A single missed tax strategy, one bad entity structure, one poorly timed asset sale can cost you multiples of that in a single year. At level 1 and 2, you were protecting a number. At level 3 and 4, you're optimizing a system, and systems need people who specialize in exactly one part of it. The investing itself changes shape here too. Back at $1 million, 60% index funds, 30% bonds, and a little mad money was the right answer because the goal was stability, not sophistication. At $5 million and climbing, sitting entirely in public markets starts leaving real money on the table. This is where you hear terms like real estate syndications, private equity, and alternatives thrown around at dinner parties by people who barely understand what they mean, but the underlying idea is simple. You're diversifying beyond what you can buy with a few clicks in a brokerage app into assets that don't move in lockstep with the stock market, assets that take longer to sell, and assets that often require a minimum check size your level 1 self would have found insane. A single real estate syndication deal might ask for $100,000 minimum. A private equity fund might want $250,000 and a 10-year commitment before you see a dollar back. This isn't a suggestion that you chase every shiny alternative investment that lands in your inbox. It's a recognition that at this size, everything in the S&P 500 is no longer diversification. It's concentration in a different costume. The entities get more serious too. At level 1, an LLC with nothing inside it was a costume, a few $100s a year spent protecting nothing. At level 3 and 4, a holding company actually starts to make sense because now there might be real estate, a stake in a friend's business, maybe proceeds from a second smaller exit, all sitting under one roof instead of scattered across your personal name, like loose change on a dresser. This is also where dynasty trusts enter the conversation, not because you're suddenly obsessed with generational wealth planning at 34, but because trusts at this size aren't about avoiding probate anymore. They're about controlling how and when money moves to the people you love, protecting it from a future divorce that hasn't happened yet, a lawsuit that hasn't been filed yet, a kid who hasn't grown up yet. You're not paranoid for thinking about this. You're just finally at a size where the downside of not thinking about it has real teeth. And then there's governance, which sounds like a corporate word for something surprisingly human. If you have a spouse, kids old enough to understand money, or even just a business partner from your original exit still involved in your finances, this is the level where you start having actual family meetings about money. Not can I get a new car conversations, structured ones. Quarterly, maybe annually, where everyone sits down and looks at the same numbers, the same goals, the same rules. Alongside that comes something called a written investment policy statement, a document that spells out, in plain terms, what your money is allowed to do and what it isn't. How much risk you're willing to take. What percentage goes where? What happens if the market drops 30% and every instinct in your body is screaming at you to sell everything? Having this written down before the panic hits is the difference between a plan and a reaction. Now, the trap, because there's always a trap. This is the level where prestige starts knocking, loudly, dressed up as necessity. You get invited to a family office summit at a 5-star resort. A firm with a name that sounds like a Swiss private bank offers to manage your money for a flat 1.5% fee, plus performance fees, plus a retainer for concierge services that mostly means someone books your restaurant reservations. You don't need any of that at $8 million. You might not need it at $20 million. The overwhelming majority of what gets sold as prestige at this level, the multifamily office with the mahogany conference room, the private bank with the name-drop clients, the advisor who leads every pitch with how many billionaires he's worked with, is priced for people with $200 million, not people with $12 million who just want their taxes optimized and their portfolio diversified without getting fleeced. Paying for prestige before you actually need it is the level 3 and 4 version of the Rolex at level 1. Same instinct, better tailored suit. So how do you know when you've actually outgrown the virtual, outsourced version of all this and need dedicated staff, an actual full-time person or two on payroll, just to manage your money? The honest marker isn't a specific dollar figure everyone agrees on, but a feeling of friction. When your fractional CFO is billing you for 30 hours a month because the coordination alone between 5 outsourced specialists has become a full-time job. When you own enough separate entities, real estate, a family trust, a business stake, an investment portfolio, that no single outsourced advisor can hold the whole picture in their head anymore. When the cost of hiring someone full-time is actually cheaper than the hours you're paying fractional people to duct tape everything together. For most people, that shows up somewhere between $25 and $30 million, though it's less about the number on the statement and more about the number of phone calls it takes to get a straight answer about your own money. That's the real milestone at this level, not the holding company, not the trust. It's the moment your finances become complicated enough that complexity itself becomes the argument for building a real team instead of renting one. Somewhere past $50 million, the thing you've been building with borrowed hours and outsourced specialists finally earns its name. This is the actual family office, not the virtual version with 5 contractors and a shared Google Drive. A real one, with a suite, or at least a floor, with people who show up every single day whose only job is you. Picture the staff roster now. A CIO who does nothing but think about your investments, all day, every day, the way you used to think about your company before you sold it. A dedicated tax attorney on retainer, not billed by the hour but paid a salary, because the tax code moves fast enough that we'll circle back next quarter isn't good enough anymore. An in-house bookkeeper reconciling 6 entities before breakfast. Sometimes a chief of staff whose entire function is making sure the CIO, the attorney, the bookkeeper, and you're all looking at the same version of reality. This is the level where my finances becomes the office, lowercase, said the way you'd say the company back when you still had one. And with real staff comes something you didn't need at level 3 or 4, an actual governance board. Not a metaphor. A real board, sometimes with an outside seat or two, people who aren't blood relatives but who show up to keep everyone honest. Because once you're coordinating a spouse, adult kids, maybe a sibling who was an early investor in your company, money stops being a personal decision and starts being a group decision, and group decisions without structure turn into holiday dinners nobody wants to attend twice a year. This is also the level where the timeline in your head has to stretch further than your own lifetime, whether you're emotionally ready for that or not. Multigenerational planning stops being a phrase in a book and starts being Tuesday. Succession planning, meaning who actually runs this thing when you can't or don't want to anymore. Financial education for kids who are currently more interested in video games than dynasty trusts, but who will one day be handed decisions with more zeros than they've ever had to hold. Values transfer, the hardest one to put a dollar figure on, The actual work of making sure the money doesn't just move to the next generation, but moves with some sense of what it's for. The legacy structures get bigger and more permanent here too. Philanthropy stops being we give to a few causes we like and starts looking like an actual private foundation with its own filings, its own board seats, sometimes its own small staff. Dynasty trusts, which showed up back at level 3 and 4 as a smart idea, now get fully built out, structured to hold assets not just for your kids, but for grandchildren who haven't been born yet, in some states designed to run for 100 years or more without ever touching estate tax again. And the investment policy statement, that document you wrote at $8 or $10 million to keep panic out of your decisions, now becomes a cross-generational investment policy, one that has to work for you at 55, your kids at 30, and eventually people who will read your name off a plaque and never meet you. Here's the part almost nobody talks about, though. Most people who reach this level did not walk here in order. They skipped. They heard family office at a dinner party at $12 million and decided that sounded like the version of success they wanted, so they built the mahogany conference room, hired the CIO, set up the dynasty trust, all before the actual complexity of their finances justified any of it. And the cost of skipping levels isn't dramatic. It's not a crash. It's quieter than that. It's a $40,000 a year staff salary paying someone to manage a portfolio that a fractional advisor could have handled for $6,000. It's a private foundation filing paperwork every year for a giving budget that would have been simpler and cheaper as a donor-advised fund. It's a governance board meeting quarterly to make decisions about $9 million that didn't need a board, it needed a spreadsheet and a phone call. The other cost, the one that actually stings worse, is losing control of your own story. Because once you've built the structure needs to be fed. Staff need justification for their salaries, advisors need to demonstrate value, whether or not that value is actually there. You end up making decisions to match the complexity you built instead of the complexity you actually have, and that's backwards. That's the tail wagging the dog with a $1.5 million operating budget. So let's walk it all the way back, because the whole point of leveling was never to rush the ladder. You started at $1 million with a $16 watch, a strategy that fit on an index card, and enough self-control to not buy the boat. You climbed to $5 million where a checklist and a fee-only advisor stopped being enough and a virtual team came in to cover the gaps. You climbed again toward $30 million where the entities got serious, the trusts got real teeth, and complexity itself became loud enough to justify hiring dedicated people instead of renting fractional ones. And now, past $50 million, you've arrived at the actual thing everyone was cosplaying at level 1 with their rented Lambo and their staged milking barn. Except you didn't buy the costume early. You built the structure exactly when the structure was needed, no sooner. That's the difference between growing into a family office and buying one off the rack before you can afford the upkeep. The expensive mistake hiding inside this entire topic isn't the trust or the board or the staff. It's building family office-style complexity years before your actual finances require it, and not realizing the mistake until you're 3 or 4 years in, staring at a report that shows you've paid somewhere north of $300,000 in salaries, filings, and retainers for a structure sized for $80 million wrapped around a $15 million reality. Nobody hands you that realization in a single afternoon. It shows up slowly, one overbuilt line item at a time, until someone finally does the math out loud. If you want to actually see that math laid out, level by level, with the real numbers instead of the dinner party version, the book that walks through this whole framework is linked in the description. It's the version of this conversation nobody has with you before you sign the paperwork.